Welcome back to my channel, which I am calling Reading in Trees from now on. That is a reference to my childhood when books were of enormous importance to me as a form of escape and just a window onto the world, and somewhere where I felt, I guess, that I could understand what was going on in the books in a world where I didn't always feel understood. As well as that, it is a bit of a preparation, an excuse in the future for me to do crossover videos into the realm of gardening and food production, which is another passion of mine and has to do with my concern for the climate crisis, as well as just my biophilia, my love for being out in nature and having my hands in the dirt. And today I'm nursing a ginseng tea because I have not been sleeping the best lately due to anxiety, I suspect, and caffeine is of no help, I'm sure. So it's herbal teas for me in 2024. Unlike the last video where I kind of did attempted a video essay structure, this video is going to be more informal. And it's ironic that I decided to put a blazer on, but a blazer is a very useful sartorial element to hold, to clip on a lavalier to. So I want to talk about the best books of the year and recommend them to anybody who would like the kinds of books that I got through. One of the things I'm going to say is that I, without intending to, ended up giving more 5 stars to non-fiction books than fiction books. And I think this is a symptom of the fact that I'm perhaps pickier about my fiction. I think that it's harder to carry off good fiction. You're creating something from nothing, and in some sense, of course, it's a compilation of memories and ideas from other books and the world and so on. But at the end of the day, it is a very creative process, and it's not that nonfiction isn't, but it's a very different and I think less inventive process, because the facts in the books, in nonfiction books, count for more. They carry the book in many respects, although I do appreciate a well-written nonfiction book. I think it was a good year for me by and large, because although I didn't read a lot in terms of like pages or words read, I did strike an average of 3.8, which is better than previous years. I kind of tend to hit 3.6, 3.7 most years, so 3.8 is slightly better. It would be a nice goal for the year to reach a solid 4 as my average. That would be fantastic, but we'll see. So the first of the books that I awarded a 5-star, and the first fiction, was Mischief by Zoe Gilbert. And this story is most unusual and not like anything that I'd read before. It really is centered around this folkloric character called Herne the Hunter that is sort of forgotten in English, in this case, English folklore, whereas Robin Hood and King Arthur and others are remembered. This guy is forgotten, and I think that was a very an intentional choice on the part of Gilbert, and it's symbolic throughout the story of our relationship with nature and how we have forgotten the folklore and forgotten the wildness in us, the mischief that Herne represents. It is structured across a timeline that begins with the 14th century, and then each chapter is a different period in history, all the way up to the 21st century and into our future. And as time progresses, this Northwood, which is situated in the city of London, is encroached upon by the city. Herne the Hunter who very much is part of the wood in a sense, has to adapt and take on new personas and new forms to find a place for himself. In each story, Herne is a mischief maker, causes trouble for other characters in the book. And sometimes it's more innocent and fun-loving, and sometimes it becomes a little bit more sinister. The book was dark, but in a deliciously macabre way. It moves from horror to humour easily and doesn't feel jarring. And each of the chapters has a different tone that matches the zeitgeist of the time, the culture that was prevalent at the time. And again, it didn't feel disjointed, as it sometimes can when you read stories that are very segmented. Of course, it's got the constant thread of it being Hearn's story and it taking place in the same area, but because it's a very different period each time, it feels very different and the characters are different. And Hearn himself takes on very different shapes. Just to give you a sense of the prose, and it's highly varied, but this is specifically the nature writing that Gilbert does in this book, really puts nature front and center and gives it a sort of personality as though it were another character in the book. So this is one of my favorite quotes. Mushrooms, gamine as wallflowers, roguish as farts. She's really a playful writer and very bold as well in her artistic decisions. But really at the heart of this book is the idea that we as a species are losing the wildness in ourselves. We're losing touch with nature, and climate change also features in this book. So it is the concrete reality of this loss of connection that we are experiencing. Nature is not a backdrop at all. Nature is what we are part of ourselves, and we're denying that. Nature is, diminutive and cheeky at times, but it's also this unfathomably powerful entity that we will eventually have to face up to, and it may even be our undoing. Ultimately, I think this book was perfectly executed. It seemed to me to be exactly what she set out to do. I was blown away. First of all, because it was not like anything I'd ever read before. I felt that it was so original. Also, the prose was very, very playful, very expert. She's a professor of literature, if I'm not mistaken. If you do appreciate prose, you should find this book to be a delight. It's absolutely gorgeous. The second and the last fiction that I granted 5 stars was The Farthest Shore by Ursula K. Le Guin. And it is the 3rd book in the Earth-Sea cycle, which I read in entirety last year. And the series as a whole was probably a 4.4 for me. However, this was the only book that I granted a 5 star, and that's because it was chock-a-block with depth and sort of philosophical ruminations by the characters and just beautiful imagery as well. I mean, she made me look at the world in new ways. The basic gist of the story is Jed and Aaron go on a quest to solve a kind of a mystery about what is happening to magic in the world. Magic seems to be seeping away. There is a loss of magic, and that is affecting other aspects of life for people in Earthsea. As they go along their quest, they visit different islands. Earthsea is made up of islands. It's an archipelago. And they find out that aspects of the world are awry in different parts, and they start to piece things together and find out who is the culprit. This book really waltzed with the idea of our own mortality, and it is full of wisdom and philosophy and depth of experience in a relationship between a young man and his hero who is aging, and when they say don't meet your heroes, and in a sense this is that, but more than that, because it is a beautiful relationship that was in every sense worth it and helps the young man to become who he is meant to be. These books are targeted originally at, and I think that this is still the case, at 12 and up, and while I think a lot of the books are appropriate enough for teenagers, some of the content is very heavy, and the recurring theme throughout these books is our own mortality and how we should face death, what it is to live and what it is to die. I don't think that all of the content, all of the themes necessarily could have been properly understood by me if I had been young when I was reading these. But other children could be a lot more precocious than me. The great battles don't really exist in this story. This isn't a story of high intensity thrills, although like the stakes are high, like incredibly high. The battles that take place are mostly taking place within the human soul. In that sense, the journey itself is a kind of a symbolic journey, a poetic journey, representing what we all have to come to terms with in our own ordinary lives. Without any kind of ambiguity around the issue, Ursula K. Le Guin is one of the top fantasy writers that I have ever read. If you like classic fantasy and you also enjoy heavy issues, like real world issues that you can relate to, then you probably will enjoy The Farthest Shore. So the third book that I read was On Time and Water by Andri Snare Magnusson, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He is an award-winning fiction writer, so he knows his stuff. He knows how to write fiction, and therefore writes narrative fiction very well. This book is a personal story, but also a story about us as a species, as a civilization. So in that sense, it's a personal story for us all. And it moves from the small and personal to the global and all-encompassing. And he does this in an interesting way, because he starts the book with stories about his family, and then he moves out to sort of Iceland, and then he starts traveling in Europe, and then suddenly he's over in Tibet, talking to the Dalai Lama. And what he does really beautifully is he ties in, connections between his family and high-profile figures, and then he talks about what is going on in Iceland and talks about the science of that and how that's also going on in another part of the world, say in the Himalayas. Eventually you start to see that everything is tied together and that this is a shared crisis. Writing is very beautiful. He weaves in poetry and science and stories, travel writing and history and myth, and he kind of stumbles across a surprising connection in language and in symbolism, in written language, between Egyptian and I think it's Sanskrit maybe, and also Icelandic language. And it's in that sense it's also anthropological. Basically what he manages to do very successfully, in my opinion, is create a feeling of awe in the reader about our connectedness. I mean, I really had to put the book down and sit back and just let what I was reading assimilate. We are all connected in inextricable ways and in profound ways. And this is also what the book is about. And it's about time, and it's about how we think about time. Generally speaking, we have a way of thinking that is stuck in the short term. We don't account for actions that have knock-on effects well into the future. And one of the very beautiful examples that he uses to try to demonstrate how this is mistaken is that when he speaks to his daughter about her grandmother's age and grandfather's age, and when she'll be that age, how when her grandchildren will be born, and how far into the future that will be. And it's such a simple process and simple math, but it's something that we don't ordinarily do. Certainly I hadn't done that. I hadn't actively done the maths, to say, to really bring home how we care about people who won't be born till the end of our lives, and in a sense after that, because the people we care about will love their grandchildren. We'll love ours, and we will want for our grandchildren that their grandchildren won't have to suffer a climate that has collapsed because of our actions now. And really what this book is about is extending love beyond ourselves and beyond our own families to our distant descendants, and also to other people of the world and other cultures of the world. Which brings me along nicely to the next book, which is Parents for a Future, written by Rupert Read, who is a philosopher who's very active in the climate movement, and he is passionately trying to do all he can. I mean, I have so much respect for this man and love for him, really, that he finds the time and energy to devote himself to everybody, every one of us. We should have more respect and appreciation for people who are sacrificing their freedom now and getting thrown into jail because they're doing all that they can. They're throwing themselves into the fight for a future for life on Earth, essentially. The whole book really centers around this idea that parents don't question the love that they have for their own children. That's like the ultimate love, is the love that a mother or father feels for their child. And you, without hesitation, would give up your life for your child. Most parents would. And it's just one of those things they don't have to think twice about. And he tries to take this incredibly resilient love, this passionate feeling we have, and he tries to logically extrapolate from that we should be showing concern also for their children and their children's children. You see how it's relating back to the other book, and how even if we don't have children, how we all do really or should care about the future generations. The book also hinges on the idea of the precautionary principle, which he's done other work in, apparently, like in his professional role as an academic. And in very basic terms, it is that if there's any possibility that something incredibly awful might happen if you take a certain course of action, you probably shouldn't take that course of action. If the risk is to all life on Earth, if it poses an existential risk, it makes much more sense to be precautious than it makes sense to take the risk to get whatever gain you would get out of taking that risk. He's trying desperately to motivate the masses. People aren't particularly rational. They're not particularly, they don't tend to be convinced by rational arguments. But there is a place for rational arguments in all of this, in the fight for our future. I do recommend his book, Parents for a Future, if you are at all interested in the future of humanity and life on Earth in general. It's Cosmos by Carl Sagan, and this was probably one of the best science books I've ever read, although you might think that it's dated because it was written back in 1980, I think, to accompany a TV series by the same name. And it was a great success, by the way. And Carl Sagan is a famous science educator, we'll say, who set out to try to break down the barriers that between lay people and science and an understanding of our world. And he thought that it was dangerous and also unwarranted. And I can guarantee you now, even though I was intimidated at first not having a physics or astronomy education at third level, the book sat on my shelf for some time before I finally picked it up in a moment of mad courage. And I think that it was extremely easy to digest and even a compelling read. You're driven forward to learn more and more, because god damn, it's the universe, and it's how stars are born, and it's like what is inside us and what we're made of, and that. How can that not be interesting? Am I sounding like a nerd? He writes the book in a very digestible way, and it kind of makes you want to take up math and physics afterwards, but just to dabble in it, not to dive in head first. So the book is about space, but it's also about our own origins, and it's about the history of science. It's, for example, that he covers lots of ancient figures from ancient Greece and Egypt who made important discoveries in math and science. It's just jam-packed with revelations for anybody who doesn't come from a scientific background or doesn't come from an astrophysics background. For me, at times it verged on the spiritual because it's very awe-inspiring. And he was outspoken. At the time, nuclear war was a threat, and he was talking about, the absurdity of humans fighting on our one precious planet over relatively ridiculous things. And I do wonder what he would have thought about the current crisis, the climate crisis, which was beginning to become more apparent at the time of his writing. And he was alive to I think till into the 90s, so he would have been aware of how the world was kind of making the first half-hearted political movements to mitigate climate change. But in any case, I'm very glad that he wrote Cosmos and gave people like me, who aren't physicists, a bit of an understanding of where we are in the universe and how we came to be here. A highly recommended read for anybody who likes science reading at all. In this book, Paul Mason's How to Stop Fascism, he warns us of the threat in contemporary times of the rise of fascism, a rise of the far right and the slippery slope to fascism. And he, at the beginning, he talks about the ideology itself and helps people who are not themselves fascist or not far on the far right, not seduced by the ideas of the far right, to try and understand where they're coming from. And it's tough for most of us, I think, who aren't finding ourselves on that part of the spectrum. It's quite hard sometimes to understand the hatred and where it's coming from. So I think thanks to this book, I have some idea now, much more at least than I used to. And then he talks also about the accelerants in our time, driving the rise of the right in different countries and more fascist ideas, including like the political response to climate change and social response, and also the growing activism for expanding rights for stigmatized group, marginalized groups, such as the LGBTQ plus community and Black Lives Matter and different movements like that, because he defines fascism as I'm going to be bedazzled now. I can feel the heat of the sun on my face. He talks about fascism, or defines it as the fear of freedom triggered by a glimpse of freedom. And of course, he's talking about the freedom that might be gained by other groups, that from the perspective of the fascist or the fascist vulnerable, let's say, the freedom gained by others shifts their place in the hierarchy and threatens their superiority as they see it. And of course, I am talking mainly about white males of European descent and Christian. And, you know, we might be forgiven for thinking that we're not really threatened by fascism with the big F, you know, as it was in World War II under Hitler's rule, and that this is an exaggeration of the issue, and that that people like Paul Mason are just profiting off fear. But in actual fact, it's gone behind a cloud. He goes on then to cover a brief history of fascism in the 20th century, and we learn that, in fact, fascism often came to power because people couldn't foresee it. Not enough people took it seriously, and fascism will often make promises. You know, it starts with populism. Promises are made because that's what people want to hear, and not because that's what the intention of the party is once they get into power. And in the time of pre-Hitler Germany, socialism was on the rise, and there was the threat of workers' rights being expanded, and fascism was partly a reaction to this. In order to grow their votership, they promised to implement socialist ideas, socialist plans. But when they got into power, that all changed, of course, and it became a very different set of policies altogether. And so in our time, we ought to take seriously what's being said on internet forums where people are fantasizing about genocide. We shouldn't just consider them to be, you know, on the outskirts of society and not to be taken seriously beyond mass shootings, because these are the groups from which fascist leaders will recruit. Their existence on its own is a springboard for fascist parties to get into power. And another one is obviously like immigration, and which is worsening as a result of climate change and wars in other regions. And it's just a big cluster. Another aspect to this book is his blame of neoliberalism, which is in itself a problematic ideology. But the promises that it made to people, it hasn't delivered on those. And as a consequence of that, we're living in a time of ennui and dissatisfaction. And we were told that this was the end of history, essentially, and that there would be nothing after capitalism. But people are still not really happy with their state of existence. And this is ripe ground for fascist groups and far-right militias and so on. But thankfully he ends with a bit of a plan for how we can prevent fascism rather than stopping it, like just stopping it before it gets going. And he sees that as essential. The three basic ideas, and they're not groundbreaking, but it is important to delineate these things. The first one is that we have to launch a kind of cultural defense. We have to stamp out fascism at its roots on an individual level and on a wider scale. We just have to have a zero tolerance policy. We need to enshrine this social zero tolerance policy into law and make it unconstitutional to be fascist, to have fascist ideas and to sprout hate. The other thing is that we need unity among non-fascist parties, so that we in the left and in the centre have to be able to make compromises so that we can work together for the shared goal of preventing a fascist leader from coming into power. So if you are interested in either politics in general or the threat of fascism, specifically if you're on the left, because Paul Mason is a socialist, but it might be interesting for you as a non-socialist to see that his perspective, because I think it's a very rational one. So the sun is back and it's intermittently blinding me, but I have a confession to make. I actually left off one of the fiction books that I gave a 5-star to right at the end of the year. So I told you earlier that I gave 2 fiction books 5 stars, which was not true. I also gave this one, Donal Ryan's The Spinning Heart, 5 stars. I had read a book by Donal Ryan a few years ago, in 2018 I think it was, and I had given that 5 stars too, and it was quite a different book, another thin volume, from the perspective of multiple characters, but not from the perspective of as many characters as occur in this book. So many characters that it's like a village of characters. You have to just get to know a character and then move on to another one. And you know, that was daring as a creative choice, because it's kind of like head hopping and it can be very confusing, and it certainly was trying now to try and remember who was who and who had said what. The story takes place in rural Ireland after the collapse of the Celtic Tiger, and it surrounds this village where one character in particular called Pokey has not been paying people the money they're due and has kind of disappeared now. And now they're dealing with not having jobs and not having money, and the social deterioration that surrounds that. I guess if you have to choose a protagonist, it would be Bobby. He's widely considered to be the most decent character, and he's very hardworking and he's handsome and he seems to have a lot going for him, but he has this he's also suffering from the economic downturn, but at the same time he has a very poor relationship with his father that kind of haunts him. Bobby's father uses his words in a very cutting way and has really damaged Bobby in many respects. But Bobby is a kind man who is not socially afraid to stand out, to stand up for what he believes in. And the flaw, I would say, that stands out in Bobby is that, unlike his father and his grandfather, he sometimes finds himself bereft for words, and he finds himself speechless actually at the worst possible time for him in the story. The prose is quite beautiful at times. The particular vernacular of each of the characters varies, although of course they're based around the same area in Ireland, but still there's an amazing variety of ways that you can speak Irish English. And sometimes it's very poetic, and there's one character, Lily, who describes the love that she has for her children, and it really struck me. But there are many quotes, but I'll just give you this one as an example. I love my children like a swallow loves a blue sky. I have no choice in the matter. It's so simple, but it's so powerful and beautiful. It was like a portrait, a snapshot of a village suffering after the economic downturn. One of the things I found out about this novel is that it was rejected 47 times before it was finally accepted. It is the debut novel of Donal Ryan, and it went on to win many prestigious awards and to be longlisted for the Booker Prize. So if that doesn't give you hope, as somebody who might one day like to publish, I don't know what does. And you know, I love these kind of stories, and it's often the case, and it just goes to show, if our work's rejected by a publisher, we shouldn't take it to heart. That wraps up my 5-star list for 2023. If you think that's a short list, you ought to know that I only read 38 books in 2023, and I'm hoping that doing BookTube now is going to be an excuse to allocate more time to reading than I have been. I thank you for sticking with me throughout the video. I'm not affiliated with anybody. I'm far too small for that, but I will include links below for books if you're interested. Making videos is proving to be a very revelatory experience because I'm not used to looking at myself or dissecting myself. It's like a jarring experience to go from having your self-awareness be here and then suddenly it's like up here, and with that growth in self-awareness comes a fair dose of self-consciousness too, I would say. That's not necessarily a negative thing. That could actually be very useful, and I'm enjoying the process of talking about books and, you know, having an excuse to read them, and even editing, which, you know, I suck at the moment. I'm trying new ways to do that, and it's an experimental process. So hopefully sooner rather than later, these videos will be getting much better. If you did enjoy this video and you'd like to see more, please consider liking and subscribing. And I heartily look forward to seeing you in future videos.